All right, well, welcome back officially then to Hebrew Story Hour. We'll be reading from Ruth 1. We're going to read Ruth 1 together. Here we go with verse 1. Vayehi bimei shafot ha-shofetim, vayehi ra'av ba'aretz, vayelech ish mebeit lechem Yehuda, lagur bisde Moav, hu va'ishto Ushne Vanav. Verse 2. V'shem ha'ish Elimelech, v'shem ishto Naomi, v'shem Shnei Vanav, Machlon v'chilyon. Ephratim mebeit Lechem Yehuda. Vayavo'u Sidei Moav, vayihyu Sham. Verse 3, Vayamot Elimelech, ish Naomi, Vatishaer he ushene vaneha. Okay, I'll pause there and translate the first 3 verses. It came about in the days when the judges judged, that there was a famine in the land. And a man from Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the fields of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. Now the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons were Machlon and Chilion, Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah. And they went into the fields of Moab, and there they were. Now Elimelech died, the husband of Naomi, and she was left with her 2 sons. Verse 4. Vayiseu lahem nashim mo'aviot shem ha'achat orpah v'shem hashenit Ruth. Vayeshavu sham ka'eser shanim, vayamutu gam shenehem machlon v'chilyon, vatishaer ha'isha mishne yiladeha umeisha. It's just a couple verses. We'll pause there, go back to verse 4. And they took for themselves wives, Moabite wives, and the name of the first was Orpah, and the name of the second was Ruth. And they lived there about 10 years. And they also, the 2 of them, Machlon and Chilion, also died. And the woman was left without her 2 children, and away from or without her husband. Okay, verse 6. Vatakom hi v'chalotecha vatashov misde Moav, ki shama'a bisde Moav, ki pakat Yehuda, et amo latet lahem lachem. Verse 7. Vatetse min hamakom asher hayita shama, ushete chalotecha ima, vatelachna, vaderech lashuv el eretz Yehuda. Stopping there, going back to verse 6. Now she got up, and her 2 daughters-in-law, and she turned away from the fields of Moab, because she had heard that while in the fields of Moab, that Yahweh had visited his people to give them bread, lechem. And she went out from the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law were with her. And they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. Okay, verse 8. Vatomer Naomi lishte chaloteha Lechna, Shovna, Isha levet ima. Ya'as Adonai imachem chesed, ka'asher asitem im hametim va'imadi. Verse 9, Yitain Adonai lachem umetzena menucha, Isha beit Isha, vatishach lahen, vatisena kolan, vativkena. Verse 10, Vatomar na la, ki itach nashuv la'amech. Okay, translating verse 8. Now, Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Go, return, each of you, to the house of her mother. May Yahweh show you chesed, love, just as you have shown to the ones who have died and with me. May Yahweh give to you find rest, each in the house of her mother, each in the house of her husband." And she kissed them, and they lifted their voice and they wept. And they said to her, "Surely with you we will return to your people." Verse 11, Vatomer Naomi, Shovna venotai, lama telachna imi, ha'od li vanim b'me'ai, v'hayu lachem la'anashim. Shovna venotai, lechna, ki zakanti mehayot la'ish, ki amarti yesh li tikva, gam hayiti halayla la'ish, v'gam yaladti vanim, halahain, tisa berna ad asher yigdalu, halahain te agena, levilti heyot laish, al benotai, ki mar li mo'od mikem, ki yatsa avi yad Adonai. I'm in verse 14 now. Vatisena kolan, vativkena od, vatishak orpa, lechamota, varut, davaka ba. Okay, now going back to verse 11. I know I read a lot there without telling you where I was. So Naomi said, "Return, my daughters. Why should you go with me? Do I still have sons in my womb that they should be to husbands for you? Return, my daughters. Go, because I am too old to be with a man, or essentially to be married, to have children. Because even if I said, there's hope for me, and also I came tonight to a man, and even if I bore sons, would you wait for them until they grow up? Is it for them that you would imprison yourselves to not be to a man, or not be with a man? No, my daughters, for bitterness to me is greater than for you. So it's more bitter for me than for you, for the hand of Yahweh has come out against me. And they lifted their voice and they wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Okay, verse 15. Vatomer, hine shava yivim tek el ama ve'el Eloheha, shuvi acharei yivim tek. Verse 16. Vatomer Ruth, al tifkei vi la'ozvech, la shuv me'acharayach, ki el asher telechi elech, uva asher talinu alin, amech ami, velohayach Elohai, ba'asher tamuti amut, v'sham ekaver. Ko yaseh Adonai li v'cho Yosif, ki hamavet yafrid beini uveinech. Okay, translating now with verse 15. And she said, look, your sister-in-law has returned to her people and to her God. Return after her, or after your daughter or your sister-in-law. Ruth said, do not press me to abandon you, to return or to turn away from you, because to where you go, I will go. In the place where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people, my people. Your God, my God. In the place, or in the place where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus may the Lord do to me, and even more, if death should separate between me and you. I want to talk about that in our discussion afterwards. Okay, verse 18. Vatera ki mit ametzet hi lalechet ita betichdal lidaber eleha. Verse 19. Vatelachna shitehem ad boana beit lachem. Vayehi kivoana beit lechem. Vatehom kol ha'ir alehen. Vatomarna hazot Naomi. Okay, let's pause there. Verse 18, translating. She saw that she was bold or stubborn, or maybe emboldened to go with her. And she stopped speaking with her or to her, probably speaking to her about it. And they went, the two of them, as far as entering into Bethlehem. And as they entered into Bethlehem, the whole city was astir, was in a tumult over them. And they said, is this Naomi? Verse 20. Vatomer alehen, al tikrena li Naomi, kirena li Mara, ki hemar shaddai li ma'od. 21. Ani mele'a halachti v'rekam, heshivani Adonai, lama tikreni li Naomi, v'Adonai anavi, v'shaddai herali. 22. Vatashov Naomi, v'Ruth haMoaviyah kilata ima, hashava misde Moav, v'hema ba'u beit lechem, bitchilat katsir so'orim. All right, in this last section, translating in verse 20. She said to them, do not call me Naomi, which means pleasant. Call me Mara, which means bitter. For Shaddai has made bitter, or has made me very bitter. I went away full, but empty. He's brought me back. The Lord has brought me back. Why should you call me Naomi when Yahweh has testified against me and Shaddai has brought trouble to me? And Naomi returned, along with Ruth, the Moabitess. Her daughter-in-law was with her, who had returned from the fields of Moab. And they entered Bethlehem at the beginning of the harvest of barley. All right, this ends the first chapter of Ruth, which, of course, foreshadowing what's to come next with the barley harvest. It's kind of, Ruth is really organized really well with scenes. There's a couple of different scenes, but it's the scene, this is the story of the move from Moab to Bethlehem. Okay, so now is your opportunity if you want to ask questions or clarify anything, and it can be certainly, if you have Hebrew grammatical questions, I encourage you to ask them, but if your questions are more thematic or exegetical or whatever you really want to ask about, we have the rest of our time to have a discussion. So anything stand out that you wanted to make sure to ask about?
Lance, I've got a question for clarification. It seems like in the middle of verse 8, there is a word that is unpointed immediately preceding the tetragrammaton. What is the deal there?
Yeah, so it's, everybody see it, it's yod, ayin, sin, hey. I don't have the Hebrew. You can follow in on a technical issue here. So I pronounced it as ya'as. And so the letters are for the imperfect form ya'aseh, which the Lord, in that case, if we read that way, it would be the Lord will be with, or Lord will show you chesed. So as an imperfect, more of an indicative statement. But in the context, it seems to be a jussive where the Lord, she is blessing them. May the Lord show you chesed. And what the Masoretes are doing, like the Masoretic scribes who are putting the vowels in to the consonantal text they have without changing the consonantal text, they're putting the vowels in for the jussive. So they're reading this as Ya'as Adonai rather than Ya'aseh Adonai. So it's called the technical term for this is Kativ Kareh. It's written one way, but you should read it another way. And actually, if you look just to the right of that word, you'll see a kof with a dot over it, and that's the sign for a kareh. And then you'll see above that, they just really small font, you'll see a yod, ayin, and sin. They're saying read ya'as, even though the consonants are ya'aseh. Does that make sense, or can I clarify that?
Yeah, thank you. I've got the BHS Reader's Edition.
Yeah.
And in my text, it's just totally unpointed. And I have a footnote.
Oh, really?
That, yeah.
Okay.
I can take a picture and show you later because I don't want to take up our time with that. But yeah, it's just, it's totally unpointed. And then it's got some explanatory notes at the bottom. So
I'm surprised
pardon me. Yeah, pardon me if my explanation might not have made sense because it doesn't seem to cohere with what you have in the Lord's edition of BHS.
Well, so what I'm reading out of is the BHS, Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, which is the same text, but it's essentially, of course, a copy or a reproduction of the Leningrad Codex from the 10th century CE. And I imagine we probably have the same footnote. The footnotes in this version will tell you about manuscript evidence. And in this one, it says that the Septuagint, or the Greek version, right, and the Vulgate, the Latin version, have essentially agree with the Kyrie, so they have some kind of form that is more like the blessing of like the jussive. May the Lord show you chesed. So there's good reason. That's why I chose Ya'as over Ya'aseh. Anytime you get a place like this, though, you kind of have to make up your mind. Do you agree with the Kativ, how it's written in the consonantal text? Or do you agree with the Kareh, how the Masoretes suggest that you read it?
Dr.
Thank you.
Hawley.
Yeah,
I,
Taylor.
I had a little struggle right there figuring out where you were looking at, because I've got the Biblia Sacra, I've got the digital BHS, and I've got a reader's edition and an interlinear laying in front of me, and all of them point the word.
How do they point it?
They have Yod with a patach, Ayin with a patach, and then the Sin and the Hay. Now, there's a little bitty circle up above the Ayin. And I don't know if that's marking the Kere or what. And they all have footnotes that talk about the Kere versus the other, but they all have it pointed.
Yeah, the little circle is anytime you see one of those in the BHS, it's saying, hey, there's a marginal note about whatever word is below that circle. And what you have, Taylor, what you described is what I have as well.
Okay.
So what Kevin had sounds like something that the reader's edition that he has anyway is doing, where there's not pointing it at all. All right, good. Other questions? Yeah, Logan.
Related, the next verse 9. I'm remembering this from Hebrew readings. It's always intrigued me that it sort of pauses, like, may the Lord grant you, and then that you find. I think we talked about then, just that pause is weird. Is it something that happened, in the copying that got missed in reproduction, or is it something that's trying to portray Naomi's emotion in this scene?
Right. It's a good observation and question. I tried to represent it in my reading, and translation. So if you everybody look at the beginning of 9, it's Yitain Adonai Lachem. So that's another blessing. May the Lord give to you, but the verb natan, to give, usually has an accusative. Giving what? May the Lord give you children, or whatever it is. And maybe we could fill in the gaps, but what's unusual is then the next verb is an imperative from matzah, umatsena, find. It's just find a security. So it could be that there's something missing. Sometimes this gets ironed out. May the Lord give you security. May the Lord grant that you find security. But that doesn't really represent the imperative. So other more recent takes on this is that, and Ruth is highly stylized. There's a lot of intention, seems like, behind the grammar. So this isn't, this proposal that I'm about to share is not that far, it's a real possibility. So that she's kind of being formal, may the Lord show you chesed, may the Lord give you, and it's sort of like she cuts off her own formal blessing just to say, oh, forget it, just find security, basic needs. In fact, I think it's Jeremy Shipper in the Anchor Bible commentary series translates it that way. He puts, oh, forget it, in brackets. Oh, forget it. Just find yourself some security. Just take care of yourself. Not that she's saying, not discounting the Lord's blessing, but just like change and register from the may the Lord, the kind of formal blessing, to this imperative, just find security. I think actually that is kind of what the grammar is telling us here, but it's strange. So there's no some try to amend the text, and sometimes that's called for, but I like that interpretation that shows the urgency of what Naomi is doing here for Orpah and Ruth.
Lance,
Yeah,
I like that explanation. One of the things I've been doing recently is trying to read the Bible from an emotional standpoint. What you said makes sense for someone that's going through what she's going through.
Yeah.
It's like, may the Lord, look what the Lord did to me. Never mind, forget it. Just go home.
Right. Yeah, I mean, Naomi's and Ruth, this is a super emotional scene, right? They're calling out, they're weeping together. There's lots of death right at the beginning, but of course then they're leaving, they're moving. There's just a tumultuous, traumatic time in life. And I do think the author is trying to represent that really well. And just one thing to track in, our our study of Ruth, our reading of Ruth is just kind of characterization. And what's the literary art in trying to represent it within these characters? How are they changing and moving? And just on that note, there's the narrator and sometimes the characters within the book of Ruth. If we just think about Ruth's character, regularly remind you that she's a Moabitess who is a daughter-in-law, who is, the one who came from Moab to Bethlehem. She's an outsider as far as her status, but then that doesn't always match up with what she's saying and what she's doing, kind of what she's demonstrating with her character. So, of course, the major scene here is when after Orpah decides to return. I don't think Orpah is to be shamed in this story for that. She tries to go with Naomi, and she's making a kind of a wise decision to return to her parents' household. But Ruth is just this kind of stubborn character. And of course, this bit of poetry where Ruth says, wherever you go, I will go. In the place where you stay, I will stay. And in my translation, I just said, your people, my people, your God, my God. Usually there's no verb there. But usually the future verb is supplied. Your God, or your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. But I think the lack of verb actually said, another way to take this is that I'm already a follower I'm already a part of your people. I'm already a follower of your God. So this is who I am. Your people are my people. Your God is my God. So much so that she's going to be buried with Naomi and Naomi's people. They're going to share a tomb. And then the last line of that is, you can take a couple of different ways. One is that she's swearing an oath, may the Lord do to me, or the Lord will do to me. There's the imperfect of ya'aseh. She's binding herself to Naomi. Kind of what's implied here is, may the Lord kill me if anything. There's one way of taking this is, anything but death should separate the two of us, or if death should separate the two of us, because she just got done saying, I'm going to be buried with you. So even death won't separate Ruth and Naomi. And I think the first way of anything but death is the way that we probably typically think of it. It's that's the marriage vow. And this is the part of Ruth that gets picked up in marriage ceremonies. But it may be that, I am going to be buried with you, and even death won't separate us. Both are possible. Okay, I just went on a little teaching moment there, but what more questions do we have here?
Could you talk a little about the word in verse 9, menucha, and its meaning and its possible relation to the name Noah?
Okay, yeah. So it is based on the same root, nuach or noach, which is rest. And of course, in the flood narrative, he's a person that God shows favor to. The land is going to, of course, be demolished, but finding security or rest, the continuation of God's mission through Noah. I mean, this word menucha does not have anything to do with Noah, but it's the same concept of security and rest. Favor is also tied into Noah's name, that God's kind of showing favor to Noah. But I think in this story, menucha, by Naomi's own description, means having security within, which mean having a household, a place to belong, a husband, children, all the kind of, the widows are brought up throughout the Hebrew Bible for good reason as people who don't have security, who are on the margins. And Naomi is there. She's sort of, she's not landless, but she doesn't have essentially a way to make money. So there's security in the household. So it doesn't have any kind of thing, really anything to do with the flood character or the Noah character, but they're kind of based on I mean, both Noah and this word have origins in this kind of meaning of security or rest. Yeah, Marisa, a virtual hand.
Looking back at verse 16, where Ruth is responding to Naomi, the lack of the verbs in the last two phrases, to me, seems to imply an emotion that's here, that maybe she is so emotional at this point that she just can't get it all out.
Yeah. It's possible. If there were verbs there, they would be to be verbs, right? The will be or are, so it'd be the haya verb, which of course Hebrew regularly doesn't have haya verbs or to be verbs. You can have verbless clauses, so it's perfectly grammatical. But yeah, certainly it's emotional. I think you're right. And even what she says that before that, don't press me to abandon you, or to, I like the word abandon, but to leave. From her perspective, and even Naomi's response to this, I mean, she can see that she's just totally resolved, and she just stops talking to her. Which it's not like being upset with her, but it's just, yeah, super emotional. That fits the your God, my God, or your people, my people. Good. Other questions or observations? John?
Yeah, I'm always interested in biblical names. They seem to have a lot of significance. And, and I didn't realize it, but I've got a footnote here that says that Bethlehem means house of food.
Yeah.
And it's kind of ironic that the book starts with the famine being there in Bethlehem.
Yeah, for sure.
And then in verse 6, the famine ends, but it's kind of like Bethlehem experiences the same thing that Ruth does, being emptied out and filled back up later.
Yeah, I think there is potentially that parallel. I mean, Lechem plays throughout the story. So it's on the one hand, I mean, it's a real place that they're from, right? Bethlehem, Judah. And it's kind of this story that revolves around this place, even when they're not there. But of course, yeah, there's irony in the house of Lechem having famine. And then, like in verse 6 that you were talking about, to give to them Lechem, at the very end, that God had visited, pakad, attended to them. This is a verb that usually, like, God starts paying attention to them or something. It's just the way it's implied, to give them bread. And of course, then there's going to be an abundance of food. In some ways, I would say it does parallel Ruth, but certainly Naomi too. As we watch this story where Naomi sort of is going away, left Moab empty, or left full, and is coming back empty. So there's this kind of filling up of Naomi in the story, and with the barley harvest and all the stuff that Ruth's going to bring back to her and everything. The names also, since you mentioned those, especially Machlon and Chilion, are famously, Machlon is like sickling, Chilion is like weakling. So all they're even Elimelech, but especially Machlon and Chilion, they're literally these kind of figures that come up at the beginning. They don't ever speak. They're just in the narrator's voice, and they're just there to die. They're like, from the very beginning, they're like figures that their names foreshadow their early demise. Not Elimelech, that's my God is king. But Ruth doesn't have a basic meaning in her, but Naomi's name, right, is at play here. Naomi means pleasantness or sweetness might work better as a play with Mara, bitterness. So she's sweetness to bitterness. And we shouldn't miss Naomi's clear theological assumption that God has done this to her. And that's just true throughout the Hebrew Bible, as slow that we may be, and maybe should be, to accuse God of tragedy in her mind. And this is just true for the basic assumption of so many of the Old Testament narratives, is that God is the one who's responsible for the ra in her life, the trouble in her life.
Yeah, the names of the two husbands, Malon and Chilion, I had a footnote also that said that these are not probably names that you would give to a newborn. Those may have been acquired later when it became obvious they were having health problems, and it probably explains why Ruth and Orpah were widows relatively early in their lives.
Yeah. We also ought to keep in mind the genre of a story like Ruth. There's a lot of literary art. This doesn't say necessarily anything about the historicity of a story, but it's a retelling of the story that the first line sets it up in the day when the judges judged, which is essentially like saying a long, long time ago. So it's really setting it back into this kind of pastoral, cultural time. We know when the tribes are disparate and this small town type of dynamics. We're unclear about. I don't think it's at all necessary to take this as a story that was written during the time when the judges judged. It's just set back in that time. One way to read this, whether it's written in this time or earlier, is that it has a part, I think, in the post-exilic context. I'm not saying that it's written during that time, but that if you imagine like when the Judahites are coming back to the land, they've journeyed from the fields of Moab, right? They've been away in Babylon and now they're back in Judah. And there's a lot of dialogue and discussion about what it means to be Jewish, what it means to be a part of the people of God. And there's several books that play in this conversation, certainly books like Esther and Daniel, which are about like the diaspora, people away from the land, and what does it mean to be Jewish. Also Ezra and Nehemiah, about dynamics in the land. Intermarriage is one of those issues. Malachi, the last prophet, the latest prophet, I think also from the post-exilic period, talks about marriage and divorce. And like they're talking at one of the major issues is, do Jews need to marry other Jews? Right? And now think about the kind of place that a book like Ruth might have in that conversation. Again, not to say that it's written during that time, but I think it could be written as a narrative. Like this isn't law, but as a narrative way of saying, but look at this story. Look what God did with this outsider who became this insider. All that to say is that although I mean, we can ask historical questions of this, I think Ruth is a different kind of story than what we see like in Judges, even if it's set back in the time of Judges, or especially different than what we'd see in a book like Kings, where there's just so much care put into the narrative details of the story.
Would you say, while this is probably historical, I mean, it's particularly saying that because of the genealogy at the close, but it's also in a sense a bit of a parable?
Yeah, so like, you know, right, I struggle with I always struggle with genre words because our English genres don't necessarily get at the Hebrew Bible genres. But there is, I don't know if I would use the word parable. I would use it for something like Jonah, parabolic text. And I wouldn't say, I really don't love any English term because it's going to spark things in your mind that won't quite fit, but there's kind of a legendary element to this. That legend has potentially like historicity to it. It doesn't have to be a tall tale. This there's not necessarily a lot of hyperbole in this story, but it's set back. It is a story in order to say something about what it means to be an Israelite, and about, I mean, Moabites are the ultimate, they're the neighbors and they're the ultimate enemy. The Moabites in Deuteronomy are not allowed in to the temple. So there's this, and yet we're going to see this woman, this foreigner, on account of her character, become part of the very line of David, right? So it does have that genealogy where everything's going to be leading up to. It's kind of a backstory for David, but really it's about like this power couple of Ruth and Boaz and how they bless Naomi, outsiders and insiders. And so, yeah, it's, we shouldn't necessarily totally suspend historical questions, but I don't think this is written to answer our historical curiosities. And even names like Machlon and Chilion, I think it's humorous more than it is trying to get at like a historical explanation for why we have these characters. I think I chalk that up to literary art, more than a concern with, a historical genealogy.
So Lance, let's pretend like someone in Babylon is putting this together.
Yeah.
And they begin the story in the days when the judges judged.
Yeah.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Or is it a romanticized thing? Because I'm thinking like, wow, would it have been cool to live in Colorado in the 1880s?
Yeah.
Well, probably not, but we might think it would be.
Yeah, I think romanticize is a really good word for this. And of course there's struggle, and that's recognized, this famine, there's difficulty and struggle, but there is a romantic idea perhaps of, before there were ever kings. And of course this is about the line of David, so there weren't kings yet. So it's kind of a temporal marker, but there's this, I think that's a good, like, when we think about narratives from the early West or something like that. Yeah, the 1800s in Colorado.
Yeah.
This prestige.
In those days when there was no sheriff in town, and that was really bad.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that works well. It sort of sets the mood for the story. I think this may not do this for us, but for ancient readers, it's even the repetitions, the narrative introductions of the way the book is introduced. It's just, everything is sort of falling in place. And it's just highly constructed. It's sort of like the prologue filling out the long time ago. And then the quick deaths, right? I mean, they're just moving past in order to get to the actual scene of moving from Moab back to Bethlehem. And it's really to introduce Naomi and Ruth.
Yeah, the story arc is sort of like an emptying and then a filling, isn't it? So you start out when there's no king, and then no husbands, no child, no food. And by the end of the story, all those things have been filled back in, including a king at the end.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, that's totally true. And that's really helpful. And then the question is, like, how do you get from point A to point B? Right. And it's about character, like characterization of Ruth here starting, and then we're going to see how we get there, I guess.
Can I ask you about, I think it's in verse 12, when Naomi is talking about the idea that, would you wait? If I had a husband tonight, and she uses the tikva, I think is rendered as hope.
Hope, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about that word a little bit? Because I know the reason that I bring that is I know that it's used in Joshua 2, whenever they say for Rahab to let a line out of scarlet. That tikva word is used there in discussion of that, and I think it's interesting how it all kind of plays together. So I'm curious.
Yeah.
What's the deal?
There's then that tikva can mean thread. There's a kind of that story, and then like Job even plays on as I always think about Job. So there's a verse in Job where there's a word play between thread and hope, and thread running out, hope running out. So it doesn't necessarily always mean both. Like here, I think it just means hope, this idea of hope. But kavah can mean to wait, and hoping is closely tied with enduring in a lot of places. And here for sure, I mean, like, it's about time. Even if I could get married again and have children, or she'll even say, would you wait for them? But here in this here is there hope for me. And that hope is tied up in security. Like for Naomi, she's just saying, I have no way to have a home again, because I can't get married. I'm too old. I certainly can't have children to get, which is all about children here. And in particular in this world, sons who can get married and, all of this. So she is hopeless because she doesn't have any time or ability, or health ability. And there's always this kind of fictitious, even tonight, right? She's being dramatic. Best case scenario, I get married tonight, I get pregnant, I have sons. First of all, she says, I'm too old for all that. But then she turns and says, and uses a different word for wait, saber. But to saber, now, would you wait until they grow up? She uses this term to agena, to imprison yourselves or bind yourself, so that in order to not get married until then, you're going to be old too. So it doesn't have anything to do with thread or rope here, but it does have to do with time still. I don't have any hope for that to happen. There's also a line that is worth talking about here at the very end of verse 13, where she says, Ki mar li ma'od mikem. So you can take that as bitterness is to me more than you. In other words, I am hurting more than you, kind of an emotional state. And she would explain that as because the Lord's hand has come out against me. Or Lord's, but I don't think it's, hey, I feel worse than you, as much as there's no longer hope for her. Like she still sees a route to security for Orpah and Ruth. And so they don't experience the mar like she is. So it's kind of it's practical, I think, more than it is just feeling. I mean, they lost their husbands too, right? Of 10 years. So it's emotional, but it's more about like practical circumstances. Good. Other observations or questions? I have just a few more minutes before our hour is complete. I'll mention one thing that's just kind of an interesting, if you're into grammar and narrative, I think it matters. The verse 14, they lift their voices, they cry out again. Then Orpah uses the vayaktol, vatishak. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but then you get varut, davaka, and the perfect verb, clung to her, and we're going to see Ruth clinging in other places. But rather than using another vayaktol, like you have vatishak, which they could have with the verb davak, it fronts Ruth in order to really bring out this contrast. But Ruth clung to her. So like this kind of emphasis with the reversing the word order by fronting Ruth here. It's really trying to put the emphasis, and this is, I think, our real introduction to the character of Ruth, where she's being contrasted with Orpah. Okay, anything else to ask or talk about? Yeah, Dennis?
You mentioned that you were going to talk about chesed. So.
Oh, yeah. Okay, good. Yeah, and we'll have to, we'll track a few words that are repeated through the story. Of course, here it's the Lord showing you chesed. And chesed is a wonderful Hebrew word that we just don't have any great English gloss for, but it gets at usually translated like steadfast love or kindness. But certainly in the story also the covenantal loyalty, certainly loyalty comes out. But I think it's a more general term. Naomi here is blessing them. So may the Lord show you chesed. God is the originator of chesed. It's key to who he is. Steadfast love kind of works well in this context, but we'll see how in many ways, and really Naomi's blessing here will be fulfilled. The Lord is going to show chesed, but we'll also see other characters acting with chesed. Even Ruth's commitment especially Ruth's commitment to Naomi is going to be an act of chesed. So we see what that looks like as Ruth demonstrates it toward Naomi. Her commitment to Naomi, her loyalty to Naomi's purposes and her well-being, that maybe loyalty for the good of another person. Love works well as long as we understand the fullness of love, not just the emotion of it, not to discount that love is emotional.
How much, Dr. Hawley, do you think this concept of love from Hebrew scripture informs the use of agape in Greek in the New Testament?
Maybe Kevin can help me out with this. But our Greek story hour guy, or maybe some of you else, some of you others. I mean, I know sometimes we overplay the distinctions of the love words in Greek. But I do think, certainly God's chesed is such a key. It just comes up over and over and over through the Hebrew Bible. Certainly it would have influenced New Testament and Greek terminology. I guess my starting place would be look at Septuagint, the Greek translation, if they use agape for chesed, and that's something I feel like I should know, but I don't know right away. Any other, Brent or Kevin, some of you guys who do a lot with Greek, have any insight in that to answering that question?
I'm checking verse 8 right now with the Septuagint. Give me just a second.
I sort of wondered whether the problems we kind of get into with agape could be resolved if we thought about it more in this way. That's, in other words, there has been a kind of controversy about the Christianization of the word agape. And if we started from the Hebrew, if this is a good parallel, would that help?
Yeah, I'm seeing it's not using agape here. I don't know if Kevin, you're seeing this, but is it
uses the term usually translated mercy?
Yeah, eleos
in the Septuagint.
Right.
BDAG, the most commonly used Greek lexicon for New Testament and early Christian literature, doesn't seem to give chesed as like a semantically related Hebrew term. If I have missed it, then my apologies, but I don't see it here under the noun form, which would be appropriate to look at since chesed is also a noun. So I don't know, although there's obvious connotations of loyalty, right? Inherent in chesed and love for someone, they don't seem to be overlapping significantly. How they're used.
It's good. There's another Hebrew word, ahav, to love, that shows up in like loving the Lord your God with all your heart in Deuteronomy 5. And just checking on that one, they use agape for that. So that word is more regularly translated in similar ways to love, where chesed is maybe more general. So word studies get complex. You have to look at all these things in context. But there's a couple of different Hebrew terms that I wonder if ahav is like agape regularly shows up for that rather than chesed. I'm not sure.
Thank you.
All right.
Very
Yes.
good.
Well, this has been good. I love this. If it's valuable to you, I'm thankful for that. And you're welcome. Come back and spread the word to others who you think might be interested. I'm going to go ahead and end our recording. I'll hang out for a couple minutes if you want to ask any follow-up questions. But thank you all for your good participation. And I'll send out a notice, but it'll be the 3rd Wednesday of September that we'll do Ruth 2. All right, so Shalom Lachem.